the alien ships hung in the sky like ominous sculptures, casting eerie shadows over a small rural town in Kansas. The once serene landscape of golden wheat fields and rolling hills now bore the weight of interstellar scrutiny. For weeks, Earth had been buzzing with news of alien arrivals, their emissaries striding into the limelight with condescension and aloofness that bordered on the theatrical. They called themselves the Dralathian Valkyries, a proud, warrior race of tall, elfin women with bronze-toned skin, piercing silver eyes, and voices that hummed like low thunder. They claimed their civilization had surpassed Earth's petty squabbles eons ago, and their visits to primitive worlds, they explained, were anthropological exercises. The Valkyries' leader, Commander Zyrina, stood at the forefront of the alien delegation. She carried herself with the kind of grace that suggested she never stumbled, never faltered, and never doubted her own superiority. She spoke into the cameras at a global press conference, her words dripping with thinly veiled disdain. "We have observed your kind for centuries," she proclaimed. "Your wars, your primitive technologies, your obsession with trivialities like farming." She paused, letting the laughter ripple through her contingent of Valkyries standing behind her. The humans in the room shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared challenge her outright. Among the audience, a lone farmer named Luke Carter leaned against a railing at the back of the room. Clad in dusty jeans, a flannel shirt, and boots worn from years of toil, Luke stood out like a sore thumb among the suits and uniforms. He wasn't supposed to be here. His town had been randomly selected for a cultural exchange, and when no one else volunteered to host, Luke reluctantly stepped forward. Now, watching Zyrina's haughty demeanor, he couldn't help but mutter under his breath, "Well, ain't she just a ray of sunshine?" The murmured remark caught the attention of one of the nearby Valkyries, a younger warrior named Karen. Her sharp ears twitched, and her eyes narrowed as she scanned the room. Primitive male humor, she whispered to a companion, who stifled a smirk. They turned their attention back to Zyrina, who continued her monologue, oblivious to the irritation bubbling in Luke's chest. This wasn't just arrogance, it was an insult to everything he and his family had worked for. Later that evening, as the Valkyries descended upon Luke's farm for their cultural immersion, the atmosphere turned from awkward to downright absurd. The group arrived in sleek, gravity-defying pods that hummed softly as they landed in the middle of Luke's cornfield. The sight of the towering Valkyries stepping out of their gleaming ships, their armor glinting under the moonlight, was surreal. Even more surreal was their reaction to the farm itself. "Is this where you reside?" Zyrina asked, her silver eyes scanning the modest farmhouse and barn with a mixture of confusion and disgust. Her voice carried a sharp edge, as though she couldn't quite believe that anyone would willingly live in such a place. "Yep," Luke replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Welcome to Earth, Commander." The Valkyries exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. One of them, an older warrior named Elise, muttered something in their native tongue, and the others laughed. Luke didn't need a translator to know he was the butt of the joke. The next few hours were an exercise in barely contained frustration. The Valkyries toured the farm with an air of detached curiosity, commenting on everything from the simplicity of the tools to the quaint methods of irrigation. When Luke explained how the irrigation system worked, Zyrina raised an eyebrow and said, "Fascinating. It's like watching a cave dweller invent fire." That was the last straw. "Look," Luke said, his voice steady but firm, "you might think we're backward, but this primitive farm feeds a lot of people. Maybe it ain't fancy, but it gets the job done." Zyrina's lips curled into a faint smirk. "How charming," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "A male defending his territory. How primal." Luke bit back a retort, knowing it wouldn't do any good. Instead, he decided to let the Valkyries experience life on Earth firsthand. "If you're gonna stay here," he said, "you might as well pitch in. We start work at dawn." The next morning, the Valkyries learned the meaning of hard labor. Luke assigned each of them a task: milking cows, tending to the fields, repairing fences. At first, they treated it like a joke, their arrogance unshaken. But as the hours wore on and the sun climbed higher, their confidence began to waver. By midday, Karen, who had been assigned to wrangle a particularly stubborn goat, was covered in mud and nursing a bruised ego. "This is absurd," she exclaimed, throwing down the rope in frustration. "Why would anyone subject themselves to this drudgery?" Luke leaned against the barn door, watching her with a bemused expression. "Welcome to the real world, princess." By the end of the day, even Zyrina looked worse for wear. Her once impeccable armor was smudged with dirt, and her normally pristine hair was tangled and matted. As she sat on a bale of hay, glaring at the setting sun, Luke approached her with a glass of lemonade. "Here," he said, offering it to her. "You've earned it." Zyrina hesitated, then took the glass with a begrudging nod. She sipped the lemonade and grimaced. "It's tart." Luke chuckled. "That's life for you." Despite her exhaustion, Zyrina couldn't help but feel a flicker of curiosity. There was something about this human, his resilience, his quiet determination, that she couldn't quite understand. For the first time, she found herself questioning the assumptions she had always taken for granted. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Luke sat on the porch, strumming a guitar and humming a tune. The Valkyries gathered around, drawn by the unfamiliar sound. It was a simple melody, but it carried a warmth and sincerity that seemed to transcend the barriers between them. Karen, who had been the most vocal in her disdain for Earth, found herself tapping her foot to the rhythm. "What is that?" she asked. "Just a little something my dad taught me," Luke replied. "Music's kinda like a universal language, you know?" Zyrina watched him in silence, her silver eyes reflecting the firelight. She didn't understand why, but in that moment, the so-called primitive farm and its unassuming caretaker didn't seem so laughable after all. The sun rose over the horizon, casting long shadows across the farm as the alien Valkyries began their second day of immersion. Luke Carter leaned against the porch railing, sipping his coffee and watching the group stir awake. It was clear that yesterday's work had taken its toll. Zyrina and her warriors moved sluggishly, their usual poise replaced with stiff limbs and muffled groans as they stretched out the aches from unfamiliar labor. For the first time since their arrival, the aura of superiority that surrounded them seemed cracked, if only slightly. "Morning, ladies," Luke called out, his voice carrying a note of amusement. "Hope y'all are ready for another productive day." Zyrina shot him a sharp look, her pride clearly stung by the first day's ordeal. "We are not defeated by mere exertion, human," she replied, her tone clipped. "Your tasks, though primitive, are manageable." Luke chuckled softly. "Glad to hear it, Commander. Today's lineup should be just as manageable." He took another sip of coffee and gestured toward the barn. "We're fixing the tractor, harvesting the south field, and dealing with the irrigation pump. Oh, and since y'all seem so keen on observing primitive life, I'll even throw in some fence-mending lessons for good measure." The Valkyries exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence from the previous day clearly shaken. Karen, still sore from her encounter with the goat, muttered something under her breath that sounded suspiciously like a complaint. Zyrina silenced her with a sharp glance and stepped forward, her expression resolute. "We will complete these tasks," she declared. "The honor of the Dralathian Valkyries demands it." Luke smirked. "Honor, huh? Well, let's see how far that gets you with a broken-down tractor." The morning began with Luke showing Zyrina and Lilise how to repair the ancient piece of machinery that had been the backbone of his farm for years. The tractor was a stubborn beast, its engine prone to fits of temperamental behavior that required equal parts skill and patience to tame. Zyrina stood over the engine, her brow furrowed as Luke explained the basics. "This lever controls the hydraulics," he said, pointing to a rusted handle. "And this here? That's the carburetor. Needs a cleanin' every now and then or it'll choke up." Zyrina's expression shifted from disdain to begrudging curiosity as she examined the inner workings of the machine. "Your technology is crude," she remarked, "but it is functional." "Functional enough to get the job done," Luke replied. "Now, give it a try." Zyrina hesitated, then reached for the lever. The tractor sputtered to life with a cough and a roar, the sound echoing across the fields. For a brief moment, Zyrina's usual mask of confidence faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine satisfaction. Luke caught the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth and raised an eyebrow. Not bad for a cave dweller, huh? The next task involved harvesting the south field, a grueling job made all the more difficult by the rising heat. The Valkyries, unused to such manual labor, struggled to keep pace with Luke's practiced efficiency. Karen, assigned to the wheat harvester, found herself battling both the machine and her own frustration as she tried to make sense of its controls. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, glaring at the levers and switches as though they were personally mocking her. "Why don't you use automated systems for this?" "Would if I could," Luke replied, his voice calm but firm. "But out here, sometimes you gotta make do with what you've got. Now, quit complaining and focus." Karen's silver eyes flashed with indignation, but she bit back a retort and turned her attention back to the harvester. Slowly but surely, she began to get the hang of it, her movements growing more confident with each pass across the field. By the time the sun reached its zenith, she was operating the machine with surprising competence, though she still refused to admit it aloud. Meanwhile, Delise and a few other Valkyries were tasked with repairing the irrigation pump, a job that required both physical strength and delicate precision. The pump, battered by years of use, had sprung multiple leaks, and Luke showed them how to patch the damaged pipes with rubber seals and duct tape. "Duct tape?" Delise asked, her voice laced with skepticism. "Surely there is a more sophisticated solution." "Duct tape's a miracle worker," Luke said with a grin. "You'd be surprised how many problems it can fix." Despite her initial doubts, Delise followed Luke's instructions and was pleasantly surprised to see the water flow restored. She didn't say anything, but the glint of satisfaction in her eyes was unmistakable. As the day wore on, the Valkyrie's struggles began to give way to small victories. Zyrina, despite her initial disdain for the tractor, had managed to repair and operate it with a surprising level of skill. Karen had tamed the wheat harvester, and Delise had gained a newfound respect for the versatility of duct tape. Slowly but surely, the alien warriors were beginning to adapt to the challenges of Earth life, though none of them would admit it outright. The turning point came in the late afternoon, when the group was tasked with mending a section of broken fence that bordered the south field. The job required teamwork, precision, and a fair amount of patience, qualities that the Valkyries, for all their combat training, struggled to apply outside of battle. "This is tedious," Karen complained as she hammered a nail into place. "Why don't you simply erect energy barriers or deploy automated drones to repair your structures?" "Because energy barriers don't keep out deer," Luke replied with a smirk. "And drones ain't much use when you're on a budget." Karen rolled her eyes but continued working. As the group labored under the fading light of the sun, a sense of camaraderie began to form. The Valkyries, despite their initial reluctance, found themselves relying on one another to complete the task. Zyrina directed the effort with a level of focus and determination that surprised even herself, while Delise and Karen worked together to secure the fence posts. By the time the fence was repaired, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the farm in a warm, golden glow. The Valkyries stood back to admire their handiwork, their exhaustion tempered by a quiet sense of accomplishment. "Well," Luke said, wiping the sweat from his brow, "y'all did a pretty good job. Might even pass for Earthlings if you keep this up." Zyrina fixed him with a piercing gaze, but there was no malice in her expression, only a hint of curiosity. "Your ways are inefficient," she said, "but there is a certain resilience to them." Luke smiled. "That's Earth for you. We might not have all the fancy gadgets, but we know how to get the job done." As the stars began to dot the night sky, the Valkyries gathered around the fire pit for another evening of quiet reflection. Luke played his guitar again, the simple melody weaving its way through the cool night air. For the first time since their arrival, the Valkyries seemed genuinely at ease, their usual arrogance replaced with something softer, something almost human. Zyrina watched Luke from across the fire, her silver eyes unreadable. She still saw him as a primitive, but there was a depth to his simplicity that she couldn't ignore. For the first time in her life, she began to question the superiority of her own people and the assumptions that had brought her here. The third day dawned in a blaze of orange and pink, the horizon painted with the colors of a sun that seemed too bright, too aggressive, almost as though it were challenging the Valkyries to face what was coming. And face it, they would, though none of them could have anticipated how the stakes would rise. Luke Carter, as always, was already awake, his morning ritual completed by the time the alien warriors began to stir. He leaned casually against the barn door, watching the group emerge from their makeshift shelter in a haze of lingering soreness and silent resignation. Zyrina led the group, her jaw set in that familiar mask of determination. But something in her step suggested a deeper tension brewing beneath the surface. "Good morning, Commander," Luke called, his drawl deliberately slow, as if testing the waters. "Hope you're ready for another fine day of down-to-earth education." Zyrina didn't rise to the bait this time. Instead, she stopped a few feet from him, her gaze fixed on the sky rather than his face. "We are ready," she said, her voice clipped but strangely subdued. Before Luke could comment on her uncharacteristic tone, she added, "What is the task for today?" Luke narrowed his eyes slightly. Something was off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Still, he wasn't about to let the day get derailed by speculation. "We're heading to the North Pasture," he said. "Cattle roundup. You'll get to meet some of Earth's finest livestock. Should be a nice change of pace." Zyrina nodded curtly, but Luke noticed her glance back at her warriors, her expression flickering with something unspoken. "Worry, perhaps?" "No, not worry, wariness." The North Pasture stretched out before them in a sprawling expanse of rolling hills and tall grass. The herd was already visible in the distance, a collection of sturdy, longhorn cattle grazing lazily under the morning sun. Luke explained the basics of herding, gesturing to the ATV parked nearby. "Simple enough," he said. "We'll use the ATV to guide the cattle into the corral. Y'all can handle the gates and make sure none of 'em break off. And remember, these animals are big but not mean. Don't spook 'em unless you want to find out how fast they can run." The Valkyries exchanged skeptical glances but nodded in agreement. They took their positions, ready to prove once again that they could conquer even the most mundane challenges of this primitive planet. But as the herding began, it quickly became clear that the cattle were not as docile as Luke had promised. One particularly ornery bull, its massive horns gleaming in the sunlight, decided it had no interest in cooperating. It charged wildly toward the fence, scattering a group of Valkyries who barely managed to leap out of its path. Zyrina's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, as she rallied her warriors to regroup. "Stand firm," she barked, her silver eyes blazing with determination. "We will not be outmaneuvered by beasts." Luke, watching from the ATV, shook his head and muttered under his breath. "Pride's gonna get him trampled." The bull's aggression set off a chain reaction, the rest of the herd growing restless and unpredictable. The Valkyries struggled to maintain control, their usual battle strategies proving ineffective against creatures that didn't follow the rules of combat. Luke, sensing the situation spiraling out of control, cut the engine on the ATV and jumped into the fray. "Y'all need to stop thinking like soldiers and start thinking like ranchers," he shouted, his voice carrying over the chaos. "It's about guiding, not overpowering. Watch their movements, anticipate where they're going instead of trying to force them." Zyrina gritted her teeth, her frustration mounting. But she couldn't ignore the fact that Luke's approach seemed to work. She adjusted her strategy, signaling her warriors to form a wide arc around the herd rather than charging directly at the animals. Slowly, the chaos began to subside, the cattle responding to the more calculated movements of their herders. By the time the herd was safely corralled, the Valkyries were drenched in sweat, their pride bruised but their determination intact. Zyrina approached Luke, her expression unreadable. "Your methods," she said slowly, "are effective. Crude, but effective." Luke smirked. "High praise, coming from you." Before Zyrina could respond, a sudden, shrill sound cut through the air. It was a high-pitched whine, almost mechanical, and it sent a shiver down Luke's spine. The cattle, sensing something amiss, grew restless once again, their nervous movements stirring up clouds of dust. "What in the hell is that?" Luke muttered, his eyes scanning the horizon. Zyrina's expression darkened, her hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of her energy blade. "We are not alone," she said, her voice low and tense. The source of the noise revealed itself moments later, a sleek, metallic drone, its surface gleaming like polished obsidian, hovering ominously above the pasture. It emitted a pulse of light that rippled across the ground, causing the cattle to panic and the Valkyries to draw their weapons. "Stand down," Zyrina commanded, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. "It's a reconnaissance unit, a Drolathian design." Luke turned to her, his brow furrowed. "You're saying that thing's one of yours?" "Not mine," she corrected, her tone grim. "But it is Drolathian. And if it is here, it means we have been followed." The drone's light pulsed again, this time accompanied by a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Zyrina's warriors tensed, their instincts screaming for action. But before they could move, the drone projected a holographic image, a figure clad in ornate armor, its face obscured by a featureless visor. "Commander Zyrina," the figure intoned, its voice cold and metallic. "You have violated Drolathian protocols by engaging with the primitives of this planet. Your mission is hereby terminated." Zyrina's jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists. "You have no authority over me," she snapped. "My mission is sanctioned by the High Council." "The Council has rescinded your authority," the figure replied. "You and your unit are to return immediately, or face the consequences." Luke watched the exchange, his instincts telling him that this wasn't just an internal dispute. The drone's presence was an escalation, a clear indication that the stakes had been raised far beyond what he'd initially thought. "What happens if you don't go back?" he asked, his voice low. Zyrina didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained locked on the holographic figure, her mind racing. Finally, she turned to Luke, her expression a mix of defiance and determination. "They will send more than drones," she said. "They will send soldiers. And they will not care about sparing your people." The gravity of her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Luke took a deep breath, his mind already working through the implications. "Then we'd better figure out how to stop them," he said. "Together." Zyrina hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Agreed. But know this, human, this fight will not be like your farm tasks. It will test you in ways you cannot imagine." Luke met her gaze, his expression hardening. "Guess we'll see if I'm up for it." The Valkyries, though visibly shaken by the drone's appearance, rallied around their commander, their resolve strengthening in the face of a new threat. As the holographic figure disappeared and the drone retreated, the group began preparing for what was to come. The tension in the air was palpable, the quiet determination of the Valkyries matched by Luke's steady resolve. They had come to this farm as conquerors, mocking the simplicity of Earth and its people. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood united in the face of a common enemy. And for the first time, Luke felt that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. "You said." "Sect." The night was alive with a strange energy, the air humming with tension. The stars above seemed brighter than usual, their cold light a stark contrast to the warm, earthy glow of the campfire that flickered in the center of the gathering. The Valkyries, still clad in their warlike attire, stood in a tight circle, their faces etched with determination. Luke Carter was among them, leaning against a rusted old tractor as he sharpened a blade, a relic of the farm's past but now a symbol of a desperate future. "You're sure they'll come?" Luke asked, breaking the uneasy silence. Zyrina nodded, her silver eyes glinting in the firelight. "The Drolathians are relentless. They will not allow insubordination to go unanswered. If the drone reported back, then their soldiers are already en route." Luke tilted his head, considering her words. "So, what's the plan? You gonna rely on all that fancy alien tech of yours to save the day?" Zyrina stiffened in his tone but didn't rise to the bait. "Our resources are limited. We've expended much of our energy reserves since arriving here. And the Drolathians know our tactics, they've studied them for years. If we're to survive, we need unconventional strategies." Luke smirked, setting the blade aside. "Unconventional's my middle name, Commander. Now, you gotta trust me, or are we gonna keep playing this game of who's smarter than who?" The Valkyries exchanged uncertain glances, their pride still stinging from Luke's earlier lessons. But Zyrina stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "We'll trust you, for now. But understand this, human, if your plan fails, it will be on your head." Luke stood and dusted off his jeans, his smirk widening. "Fair enough. Let's get to work." The first few hours were spent transforming the farm into a battlefield. Luke's plan was simple but audacious: use the terrain and the farm's resources to level the playing field against an enemy that vastly outclassed them in firepower and technology. The Valkyries, though initially skeptical, quickly threw themselves into the task, their warrior instincts adapting to the strange tools and methods Luke introduced. Barbed wire fences were repurposed into traps, the sharp metal coiled into hidden snares designed to tangle the legs of the Drolathian drones. Old irrigation systems were rigged with gasoline, turning them into makeshift flamethrowers. Even the cattle were brought into the strategy, their natural instincts leveraged to create chaos in the event of an attack. As the preparations continued, an unspoken camaraderie began to form between Luke and the Valkyries. Where once there had been mockery and disdain, there was now a grudging respect. Zyrina, in particular, found herself re-evaluating her opinion of the human. He was stubborn, yes, and often infuriatingly smug. But he was also resourceful, courageous, and, most importantly, unshakable in the face of adversity. By the time the Drolathian ship arrived, the farm was unrecognizable. The once peaceful fields were now dotted with defensive structures, the barn fortified into a makeshift command center. The Valkyries stood ready, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. Luke was with them, a shotgun slung over his shoulder and a determined glint in his eyes. The ship descended with an ominous hum, its sleek, black hull reflecting the moonlight. It hovered above the field for a moment, as if assessing the situation, before a ramp extended from its side. Out stepped the Drolathians, tall, imposing figures clad in armor that seemed to absorb the light. They moved with an eerie precision, their weapons held at the ready. "Commander Zyrina," their leader called, its voice cold and metallic. "You have defied the Council's orders and consorted with primitives. Surrender now, and your punishment will be swift." Zyrina stepped forward, her energy blade igniting with a hiss. "I will not surrender," she said, her voice strong and clear. "Not to you, not to the Council, and certainly not to cowards who hide behind machines." The Drolathian leader tilted its head, as if amused. "Very well. Then you leave us no choice." With a gesture, the Drolathians advanced, their weapons glowing with deadly energy. But before they could fire, Luke raised his hand, signaling the Valkyries. "Now," he shouted. The farm came alive in an instant. Hidden traps sprang into action, the barbed wire snares latching onto the legs of the Drolathian drones, throwing them off balance. The irrigation system roared to life, jets of flame shooting out and forcing the attackers to scatter. The cattle, spooked by the commotion, stampeded through the field, creating chaos in the enemy ranks. Zyrina and her warriors seized the opportunity, charging into the fray with a ferocity that took the Drolathians by surprise. Energy blades clashed with alien weapons, the air crackling with the sound of battle. Luke, meanwhile, moved through the chaos with a surprising agility, his shotgun barking as he took down drones and provided cover for the Valkyries. The battle was brutal and chaotic, the farm's defenses tested to their limits. But Luke's plan held, the Drolathians struggling to adapt to the unconventional tactics. One by one, their forces fell, until only their leader remained. Zyrina faced the Drolathian commander, her energy blade humming with anticipation. "It's over," she said, her voice cold. The commander hesitated, its visor reflecting her determined gaze. "You think this is a victory," it said. "The Council will not stop. They will send more, and when they do, your precious human will suffer for your defiance." Zyrina didn't flinch. "Let them come. We will be ready." With a swift motion, she struck, her blade slicing through the commander's armor. The Dralathian fell, its lifeless body crumpling to the ground. For a moment, there was silence, the battlefield eerily still. Then, slowly, the Valkyries began to cheer, their voices rising in a triumphant chorus. Luke joined them, a grin spreading across his face as he leaned against a fence post, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "You did good, Commander," he said, tipping his hat. "Real good." Zyrina approached him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "So did you, Luke Carter. Perhaps Earth has more to offer than I thought." Luke chuckled, shaking his head. "Told you. We're full of surprises." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the farm stood as a testament to their victory. The Valkyries, once proud and aloof, now looked at Luke with genuine respect. And for the first time, Zyrina allowed herself to smile, a small but genuine expression of gratitude. "Thank you, Luke," she said. "For everything." Luke shrugged, his grin widening. "Ah, shucks, Commander. It was nothing not." But as they began to clean up the battlefield and tend to their wounded, both knew the fight wasn't truly over. The Dralathians would return, and when they did, they'd need to be ready. Together. For now, though, they had earned a moment of peace, and a new sense of camaraderie that would see them through whatever challenges lay ahead.